Why do you have it locked? Harriet, I heard some funny noises coming from your room. Are you okay? Really, I'm fine, she sounded irritated now. A click sounded at the door, and it sprung wide open, revealing a key on the other side and a hand that followed. It belonged to her nanny, Mrs. McFarlane. Well then, she came in with a reddish round face and very light hairs that glowed like a halo, framing a light sprinkling of freckles. I brought you some tea and... Gracious! How can you have that window open and the chill and it's raining and all? She quickly went to shut the thin paned glass that separated them from the outside, then returned to face Harriet with hands on her broad hips. You and your daydreaming will make you catch your death, and it will be all on me when it does. Harriet looked back out the old, warped glass window longingly. Had it all just been a dream? The shushing sound of a steady rain picking back up was her only answer. She watched as beadlets of water clung to the panes of glass like little jewels. Harriet gripped the edge of the heavy gray quilt that still covered her lap. Mrs. McFarlane came and tenderly tucked her in the sides. Tea lay neglected on the table where she had hastily cast it aside to protect her young charge from the deadly elements. Mrs. McFarlane really wasn't all that bad. Perhaps a little overbearing at times, but she cared for Harriet like one of her own and had been in the girl's life since before she could remember. Harriet felt a little silly still having a nanny at her age. Blasted legs! She thought she was old enough to do everyday things on her own regardless, but her parents were so overly protective of her. She wasn't sure if she would ever get to do anything for herself so long as she lived. There were some good things that came of being a privileged child, albeit a crippled one. She grew up with an unmatched education. Her parents set up the best tutors money could buy, and was for want of nothing. But she would have gladly given it all up to go to a regular school like the other children. Sometimes having money seemed a bit of a burden when it kept you from doing the things that you truly wanted. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage with wings permanently clipped. She longed to be free, but all she could do was look out from the inside. She ached to dance, like she saw the actors do in so many movies. Having pretty dresses and bows just weren't enough. Living vicariously through the silver screen wasn't enough either. But it could never be. She would never move like that. Images of how she saw them glide across the stage in time to the lively music swirled around in her head. Tears threatened to well up in her eyes again, but she was determined not to let them show. She thought quickly of the rabbit. Oh, Nanny, I just had the most beautiful dream. Did you now? Before she could continue, a tiny bell rang through the halls. It was the telephone. Mrs. McFarlane threw her hands up. It never stops. And who would it be at this hour? Oh, some other time, child. It's late after all. Shall I tuck you in before I leave? She added hastily as the telephone continued to ring. No, thank you. I can do it myself. I'd like to stay up a bit longer so that I can write in my journal, if that's all right. Mrs. McFarlane's eyes softened. The poor child. All she had were her books and momentary musings to keep her company. Her parents were out late again, to another lavish dinner party past the time they were supposed to have returned. But she had to get back to her own family before the day was completely out. All right, but see that you don't stay up too late. Mrs. Gardner is up next door, and will see to anything you need before your parents return. I'm off to my home after I see to this infernal ringing. Good night. Mrs. McFarlane patted her on her shoulder before leaving. Harriet smiled, for perhaps the first time in months. She grabbed her sketchbook and pen and began to write. Nothing but bluebirds all day long.